Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I appreciate it very much. This is the cover page of the New York Review of Books of October 9th. That's 11 days ago. And what have we got here? Hey. It's always technology that gets you. Here we go. Okay. Thanks again. As said, this is the cover page of the New York Review of Books of October 9th. And what have we got here? Well, we've got the person who should have won the Nobel Prize in Literature if they weren't so politically correct in Stockholm, Philip Roth. I love my Swedish brothers and sisters, but they just haven't got it right, you know, regarding the Nobel Prize in Literature. We've also got the two presidential candidates, John and Obama. And I don't know if you know it, but we have polls done in Europe, and if we could vote for the election, 86% of the Swiss would vote for Obama and 6% for McCain. In Denmark, it's 90% for Obama and a small percentage for McCain. But of course, we cannot vote in the elections. We've got another president, Jefferson, here, and his concubine. We've got Evelyn Waugh, a very famous British author who's in fashion again because the filming of Brideshead Revisited. And we've got infrastructure. So, you know, how does that make sense? You know, we have two world famous authors. We have presidents to be and a president who has been, and infrastructure. I've subscribed to the New York Review of Books for 25 years, and I've never seen infrastructure on the front page before. So what does that tell us? That the cultural elite in New York City, in Manhattan, has now realized that infrastructure should be on the front page of their magazine. Well, it tells us that infrastructure is important. When they've realized it's important, everybody has realized it's important. Here's The Economist from June this year, a few quotes. According to The Economist, never before has infrastructure spending been so large as a share of the world GDP, gross domestic product. Not even when the transcontinental railway was built here in the United States, or when Great Britain was crisscrossing their island with rail, was the share of GDP spent on infrastructure as large as it is now. Over half of the investments are in emerging economies now. It's $22 trillion in the next decades, and globally it's 30 to 40 trillion dollars in the next decade. And as the economists say, it's the biggest investment boom in history. So it's really huge, it's really big time, and that's one sense in which infrastructure is important, that it's simply becoming a huge part of the economy. But it's also important in the sense that Gerald Caden hinted at, that infrastructure is actually falling apart in many of the mature economies. So here, if you don't get your favorite job with Frank Gehry or Zaha Hadid, there'll be lots of jobs in infrastructure in the future for architects and planners, according to these figures. When I'm talking about infrastructure here and in what follows, I mean a lot of different types of infrastructure, from transport system over IT to Olympics, sports, public buildings, urban regeneration, power projects, dams, water projects, oil and gas projects, etc. So basically everything that forms part of the physical makeup of our society is included here. And the basis for my presentation is mainly two books, Mega Projects and Risk, which came out in 2003 on Cambridge University Press, and a new book, which is a couple of months old, called Decision Making on Mega Projects, which came out on Edward Elgar. And there'll be lots of papers in case any of you are interested in reading more on my homepage. I'll be following a real simple agenda, looking at the problems of infrastructure, the causes to those problems, and the cures to the problems. So let's start with the problems. Well, cost overrun is a huge problem with the mega projects, as are delays, time overruns, and benefit shortfalls. I'm going to be focusing in my slides here and in my numbers on cost overruns, but that's only due to time constraints. I could present similar results for delays and benefit shortfalls. But as you see here, the average cost overrun for rail projects is 44.7%, and for bridges and tunnels, 33.8%, and for roads, 20.4%. These are all in constant prices and calculated from the time of making the decision to build the project. So they're pretty conservative figures in that sense. If you took earlier estimates and if you included inflation, the figures would be much higher. Those of you who know about statistics will also know that the standard deviations are large and know that a high average overrun combined with a large standard deviation spells risk to the second degree. So that's the situation. The risks of cost overrun are very high on projects like this. Here are some examples. The Channel Tunnel between France and the UK had a cost overrun of 100%. The Denver International Airport, 200%. Boston's Big Dig, 224%, and the world record, the Sydney Opera House, 1,400%. Does anybody know who the architect was on the Sydney Opera House? Jørgen Utzon, yeah, a fellow Dane, of course. Can anybody mention another building that he designed after the Sydney Opera House? Sorry? Yes, correct. A small church in Copenhagen, Bagsvær Church. Any other buildings? How come? For me, the 1,400% cost overrun here is not the real cost of the Opera House. The real cost is the fact that Jørgen Utzon never got to do another important building in his life. He's not dead, he's still alive actually, he just turned 90 earlier this year. And in this way, you know, people often get surprised when I say that I think that the Sydney Opera House is a disaster, a mega project disaster. But in the sense that it destroyed Utzon's career and destroyed the possibilities for the rest of the world to get their Utzon-designed opera houses or whatever the buildings would be, it is a disaster in this sense. Of course, it's a wonderful building. It's my favorite building in the world, so I have this love-hate relationship with it. I love the building because it's so wonderful, because it's there. I think most people who have sailed up to the Opera House or walked, you know, between the two halls will have been affected in some way or other. But at the same time, I hate the project as such for having destroyed a brilliant architect's career. That's a real disaster, and that's the real cost of the Sydney Opera House. A few key observations regarding cost overruns. 9 out of 10 projects have them, so don't believe people. You often hear the saying that, well, big projects always have cost overrun. That's an exaggeration. It's only 9 out of 10 projects. Overrun is found in 20 nations on 5 continents, and it's been constant. This is probably the result in our research that surprised me the most, that for 70 years there have been no improvement in cost estimates. Our cost engineers freak out when you tell them this. For 70 years, your results have not improved. There's the same inaccuracy in the results. But that's the fact, that's the way it is. Let's look at a case in point, the Channel Tunnel. an ex-post evaluation that was done. Well, the actual cost, as already mentioned, were 2 times the forecasted costs. The actual benefits were half of those forecasted, and the actual net present value on that basis has been calculated at minus $17.8 billion. The internal rate of return is minus 14.45%, and the conclusion of the transport economist who did this study is the British economy would have been better off had the tunnel never been constructed. This is the sad story of too many mega projects today as they are built today. That's the problem. And the planning implications are pretty clear. Decision makers cannot trust the promoters' information about major infrastructure, meaning, typically projects like this are supported by cost-benefit analysis, environmental impact statements, and social impact statements. And it turns out when you do before and after studies on these statements, that the information simply does not hold up to what happens in actual facts. So this generates very high and systematic risks, and therefore we have a strong need for methods and incentives that would produce more reliable information so that decisions can be based on information instead of on misinformation, which is the case today. And just to show you that it's not only transportation projects, here are a few numbers for IT projects. The average cost overrun for IT projects is 43%. The percentage of projects that are over budget, over time, and under scope is 71%. The total project waste per year in IT is $55 billion in 2004, and this is just in the US, not on a global scale, so it would be much more if we looked at the whole world. But that's the situation for IT, so transportation planners shouldn't feel too bad. This is in IT also, and the same would hold up if we looked at the statistics for water projects. So the main problems, to round up the first item in my agenda, problems. The main problems are cost overruns, time overruns, benefit shortfalls. So in short, you could say these projects are over time, over budget, over and over again. So next question would be, what is the cause of all this? What causes these problems? What causes this very distinct, very established pattern of cost overruns and benefit shortfalls? Well, if you look at the literature, you'll find 3 types of explanation: technical explanations, psychological explanations, and political economic explanations. Technical explanations will explain the cost overruns and the benefit shortfalls in terms of inadequate data and models. You will hear modelers say, well, we had inadequate data, or our models have not been brought up to date. We have old models. We need to develop our models further. But if we get better data and better models, we'll be able to get more accurate results. So that's technical explanations. Psychological explanations explain overruns and shortfalls in terms of optimism bias. This is research done by people like Daniel Kahneman at Princeton University and other behavioral psychologists, who argue that human beings are hardwired, up here in our brains. We are hardwired to look at things in a more positive light, and especially look at the future in a more positive light than is actually warranted by actual outcomes. And obviously, an optimistic budget is a low budget. Optimistic cost estimate is a low cost estimate. And obviously, an optimistic benefit estimate is a high benefit estimate. So that would fit the data, optimism bias. The third type of explanation, political economic explanations, explain in terms of strategic misrepresentation. This is a term that I've learned to use because people don't like it when you say lying. George Orwell would like this term very much. It's really a kind of newspeak, but people get incensed if you talk about lying. But if you say strategic misrepresentation, they say, yeah, okay. That sounds like you got to be some kind of professional in order to do strategic misrepresentation, so that's acceptable. So that's what we call it. Martin Wax, who used to be at Berkeley as a professor and who is now director of transportation research at Rand Corporation in Santa Monica has developed explanations of cost overruns and benefit shortfalls in those terms, and so have I myself. Now, if you try to fit these different explanations to the data, you'll see that technical explanations don't fit. If technical explanations were valid, you'd expect to find forecasting errors, forecast of costs and forecast of benefits, to have an average error around 0 and a normal distribution. Now, we find with an enormously high level of statistical significance that the forecasting error is not 0, as you saw before. And these are like 0.00001 statistical significance, a level of significance that you rarely find in statistical analysis. We find here. So we can really, with a very high level of confidence, reject technical explanations as valid explanations for the statistical pattern we see in cost overruns and benefit shortfalls. But both psychological and political economic explanations actually fit the data. And what we've found is this relationship between these two types of explanation. Here, on the first axis, is political and organizational pressure for given projects. And on the second axis is the explanatory power of these different explanatory models. So here's first optimism bias and second strategic misrepresentation. And what we find is that for projects where there's very little political and organizational pressure, optimism bias accounts for the data better than strategic misrepresentation. That means optimism bias would explain cost overruns and benefit shortfalls to a larger degree than strategic misrepresentation, because in these kinds of projects, there's really no reason for the promoters or the planners to misrepresent in a deliberate way. Whereas in projects with a very high level of political and organizational pressure, you know, where your boss is breathing down your neck, make this project go through, make this project get the go-ahead so that we can actually get to build it. There's a high level of strategic misrepresentation. This model best account for the data, and optimism bias is less pronounced. And of course, a lot of mega projects, a lot of the very large projects are out here. So this is what we find for the large project. But we do have the whole scale here, and of course, a lot of medium-sized and small projects in the middle that are actually subject to both types of behavior. What we find, sometimes deliberate and sometimes not, is something I'd call Machiavelli's formula. It's like Machiavelli, even though he died almost 500 years ago, is alive and well, working as a consultant, you know, to the people who are developing and implementing these projects. And what Machiavelli whispers in their ear is, underestimate the costs, overestimate the revenues, undervalue the environmental impacts. I'm not talking about environmental impacts here, but we have separate studies of environmental impacts, but due to time constraints, it's not possible to go into details. And the same with development effects. But Machiavelli would say, be sure you overvalue the development effects. If you do all these things, my dear prince or promoter, you'll get funding. So that's, you know, it's as if this formula is at work. You know, you can explain the outcomes, or they certainly fit this formula. Here's a couple of examples from interviews we did with planners on how this works in practice. And it's a direct quote from one of these interviews, a planner talking about cost underestimation. This planner says, you'll often, as a planner, know the real cost. You know that the budget is too low, but it's difficult to pass such a message to the councillors, that's the politicians, and the private actors. They know that high costs reduce the chances of national funding. So because the big bosses know that if you put in high cost in the cost estimates, it'll reduce the chances of national funding, you cannot do that as a planner, even though you know the real costs. Here's another quote, also from a planner. It's all about passing the test of project approval. You are in when you are in. It means that there is so much focus on showing the project at its best at this stage. That's the stage of approval. So obviously, getting these kinds of statements and seeing this Machiavellian formula possibly at work in the projects, we think as researchers, hey, is this a conspiracy? Do these people really sit down and conspire to misrepresent the projects? So we asked this in the interviews, testing for conspiracy theories. And a planner here said, which was typical, I don't think it's very deliberate. It's not that people sit around a table and make strategies to get money out of a government. It's more that everybody knows of the competition, meaning the competition between projects. So you need your project to look good on paper, because otherwise your competition's project is going to get the funding because it looks better on paper. That's the idea here. So you may say, hey, that's nice. It's not a conspiracy. It's not that bad, but it's actually, in a way, you could say it's even worse because they don't even have to sit down and conspire. It's like a culture. Everybody knows already, like the interview person says here, everybody knows of the competition. Everybody knows so well they don't even have to sit down and coordinate their actions. Everybody knows, so you just do it. That's the situation. There's a culture of misrepresentation in these projects. So you get a topsy-turvy incentive structure. What you get is, when people behave like this, is that they maximize the benefit-cost ratio at approval, when the project is approved and when you do your benefit-cost analysis on paper. But if you do that, if you maximize the benefit-cost ratio at approval, that's logically the same as maximizing your benefit shortfalls and cost overruns at implementation. The higher you exaggerate the benefits during approval, the larger benefit shortfall you're logically going to have. The more you underestimate the costs at approval, the larger a cost overrun you're logically going to have at implementation. So that's what's happening. And if you do that, you're maximizing the size and frequency of disasters. If by disaster you mean, of course, cost overruns and benefit shortfalls, and that means you're getting what I call survival of the unfittest. And if I'm lucky, I'll get Darwin here in the right-hand corner, standing on his head, because this is inverted Darwinism. We actually have an area of planning here where the actors involved have been able to subvert Darwin. That's pretty impressive, There's not many corners of nature where you are able to set this selection process that Darwin described, to put parentheses around it and say, hey, we're not going to do Darwin, we're going to do something else, we're going to do the opposite. When you'd think nature wouldn't allow that, but it happens here. So those are the causes. Again, the problems are cost overruns, time overruns, benefit shortfalls. The causes, as I've argued, is an inverted Darwinism that produces survival of the unfittest due to strategic misrepresentation and optimism bias. What can we do about it? How can we solve this problem? Do people want it to be solved, or is it okay the way it is? That's another issue. Let's look at that. If we want to do something about it, we need to do things differently, meaning we need different methods for policy and planning. For instance, a method that we've developed in my research group called reference class forecasting, but there are other methods as well. And we also need better incentives. The problem today is that the incentive structure is completely topsy-turvy. It's upside down. You actually have incentives that incentivize planners to misrepresent projects. You get rewarded for misrepresenting projects, and you get punished if you're honest, if you are accurate in your cost estimates and benefit estimates. And of course, you get exactly what you incentivize, so you get cost underestimations and benefits overestimations. Let's look a bit at reference class forecasting as a method. The basic logic of reference class forecasting is or says that the best predictor of performance in a planned project is actual performance in a class of implemented comparable projects. So basically what it says is, look at the projects that you've already done that can be compared to, or that have already been done, that can be compared to the project that you're planning to do now, and you'll get a better prediction of what's going to happen with your project than if you try to understand the project as a unique project inside out. Reference class forecasting is based on theories that won the Nobel Prize in Economics 2002, prospect theory and the planning fallacy. That's Daniel Kahneman, who developed this theory with his colleague Amos Tversky. This is the King of Sweden, King Gustav Adolf, and this is the Nobel Prize, in case you haven't seen one before. I'm actually going down to meet with Kahneman the day after tomorrow. We're doing research together on the planning fallacy, on the understanding in a deeper way what it is. Let's talk a little bit about the planning fallacy. Basically, it states that people underestimate costs, completion times, and risks of planned action. It's really something that's worth to know about for those of you who are working with planning and planning to be planners, since it's a basic fallacy that planners are particularly subject to. In addition to underestimating cost, completion times, and risk, people overestimate the benefits of the same actions. So this underestimation plus overestimation is the planning fallacy and is optimism bias. This is what we talked about earlier when we talked about the problem with the mega projects. And one thing that Kahneman also found, which is really worth noting, a lot of people assume this is not the case, but that's the fact that experts are as prone to the planning fallacy as are lay people. A lot of people think if we just bring in the experts, we'll get correct estimates. That's not the case. Experiments have shown that experts will make errors just as lay people will do in these kinds of estimates. The cause of the planning fallacy, argues Kahneman, is what he calls an inside view, where the planners are focusing on the elements of specific planned action, seeing them as unique. And you'll hear this again and again when you talk to mega project planners, like I do in my research. You'll hear them say, you cannot compare projects. It's impossible. Each project is unique. Now, our statistician laughs when he hears this because he says, just look at the curves. They are so similar regarding cost overruns and benefit shortfalls and so on, that it's ridiculous to talk about the projects as being unique. But both is true in a sense, because if you really go into the details, projects, of course, are unique. But if you look at statistics, describing key characteristics of projects, they're not unique at all. So what the planning fallacy and the reference class forecasting does is to substitute the inside view with an outside view, which is the cure of the planning fallacy. And the outside view focuses on outcomes of similar actions already completed. So Kahneman argues that instead of this inside view, we need to take this outside view. Reference class forecasting is a method for systematically taking the outside view and bypass optimism bias and strategic misrepresentation by taking the outside view. So that's the general logic. And you do it by these 3 steps. I'm not going to go into the technical details. I mean, you can do this in a lot of technical details with all the statistics and statistical tests and so on. I'm not going to do this here. I'm going to stay with the principles. And doing that, there are these 3 steps. First, you identify the relevant reference class of past similar projects that are comparable to the project that you're doing. So if you're doing an opera house or a concert hall, you will go around the world, you will look at similar opera houses or concert halls that have been built and that can be argued to be comparable to the one that you are planning now. Then you establish probability distribution of outcomes for that reference class, meaning you look at specific measures of performance. For instance, what was the cost per seat if we stay with the opera house, per seat for spectators? Or what is the square foot price? Or what was the cost overrun of these projects? How many people actually showed up compared to what was predicted, and so on and so forth. You basically decide what are my key parameters going to be in forecasting for this project, and those are the one you establish probability distributions for in the reference class. And then you take your specific project and compare it to the distribution, and on that basis decide where are you on the distribution for these projects. And that's how you decide the outcome of the project that you're planning, instead of trying to understand the project inside out. The projects that are suitable for reference class forecasting are projects that are non-routine locally, but are routine nationally or internationally. So you need to have projects somewhere in order to be able to establish the reference class. But where the method is particularly useful is where local planners don't have a lot of experience with a particular type of project, but then can import that experience, so to speak, from the national level or international level. This is the situation, for instance, for concert halls, sports stadia, major bridges and tunnels, metros, urban regeneration schemes, and so on. You do very few of those in each individual city, typically. Especially if they are medium-sized cities, which the majority of cities are. So it's a very common situation around the world. Projects that are not suitable for reference class forecasting would be truly unique projects, projects that have never been done before. If you have a completely new technology or completely new design that has no prior example, then you just can't use the method because it'll be impossible to do a reference class. We've been involved in implementing this method in the UK, and it's actually now mandatory in the UK for all transport projects larger than 40 million pounds, which is equivalent to $68 million. So the Treasury has simply decided that there's no funding. They will not give any funding to projects above this size unless they have applied the methodology of reference class forecasting. The same for the Department for Transport in the UK, except the threshold level is lower, it's 5 million pounds. The largest project which has been subjected to reference class forecasting, and there are dozens of projects now that have been, is the Crossrail project in London, which is estimated after the reference class forecast at 16 billion pounds, which is equivalent to $27 billion. That's almost twice the size of the Big Dig here in Boston. So it's a huge project. The Big Dig is the largest construction project in US history, as I understand it. So this is a project in London almost twice that size. So you can imagine the size of the project. And reference class forecasting is also used in the Netherlands, Denmark, Switzerland, and South Africa. And just recently, the director of the Federal Transit Administration here in the US have been talking about trying out the methodology also. The American Planning Association has endorsed reference class forecasting. APA encourages planners to use reference class forecasting. Planners should never rely solely on civil engineering technology as a way to generate project forecast, APA stated in a news release. Much to my surprise, I was really surprised that they came out so clearly on the basis of a paper my research group and I published in the Journal of the American Planning Association. They just made this news release at the same time as the paper came out, and of course we were delighted. Let me sum up by going back to the Opera House and illustrate some progress here. We had a 1,400% cost overrun, as already mentioned, on the Sydney Opera House. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, which is here. It had a cost overrun of 185%, and it's designed by Frank Gehry, of course, as anybody can see. And it's what Frank Gehry called his near-Utzon, playing off near-death experience. It's his near-Utzon experience that the project became such a scandal, just like the Sydney Opera House did in Sydney when Utzon was building it. And I don't know if you know this, but Utzon actually just dropped the project in midstream and secretly left the country and never came back. And rumor says that he's never seen the finished house. And I've talked to his son, Kim Utzon, who's also an architect, and he verifies this. He says his father has never been back to see the Sydney Opera House. Well, Gehry was getting into that kind of situation, except it was really hard for him to get away. He lives in Los Angeles, and only a few miles from where the Disney Concert Hall was built, his home and studio was in Santa Monica. And he couldn't get away from there unless he actually left the city or the country, which he actually considered. He said, he still says, this is my darkest time. The darkest time in my life was when we were working on the design of this, and the cost went up, up, up. He couldn't go out for dinner. People would come up and criticize him. You know how the architect often gets the blame when the costs go up on their projects. So Gary basically decided, I'm not going to have this happen to me again. I'm going to build on budget and on time in the future. I'm going to find out how we can do this. And he started working with methods that are somewhat similar to reference class forecasting. Some of you may know CATIA, you know, the program that he's using to digitize his projects. And actually, in a very short span of time from this nightmare project, it's very beautiful, but it was really traumatic to build, to my second most favorite building in the world, the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain, which had a zero cost overrun. It was built on time, on budget. It's making a lot more money, both for the museum and for the city and for the region than was forecasted. But what's really interesting here is this kind of progress from this disaster to that near Utzon experience for Gary to building on time and budget. And these are really complex structures, as those of you who have studied them know. These are probably some of the most complex buildings, at least modern buildings, built in the world. Certainly the Bilbao Guggenheim was considered the most complex building at the time it was designed and built during the 90s. But even for such difficult projects, it's been possible to get to a situation where one team, Gary's team, and the people that he works with are able to build on time and budget again and again. It's not just a single fluke, a lucky circumstance. It's something that they are able to reproduce. Now, my point here is that if they can do it for these very complex kinds of projects, it's possible to do it for much more mundane projects like many of the other mega projects are. So since it's possible to do it, I think we should just do it. Thank you very much.